1902, 5 companies merged to create the most powerful agricultural empire America had ever seen, International Harvester. For 82 years, that name meant something. It fed the country. Then a CEO from Xerox showed up, picked a fight with his own workers, and burned the whole thing down in under 5 years. So, to understand how International Harvester died, you need to understand how big it was when it was alive. The roots go back to 1831. Cyrus Hall McCormick, a Virginia inventor, built a mechanical reaper that could do the work of 5 men with scythes. He patented it in 1834, moved to Chicago in 1847, and started the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company. The man was a better salesman than he was an inventor. He pioneered things like money-back guarantees, installment payments, and a network of trained field salesmen who could demonstrate the machines on actual farms. Farmers didn't buy from catalogs. They bought from a guy standing in their field showing them how the thing worked. Meanwhile, William Deering had built the Deering Harvester Company into a serious competitor. By the late 1800s, McCormick and Deering were locked in one of those rivalries that got personal. Salesmen from both companies would show up at the same farms, sometimes the same fields, trying to outdo each other. There are stories of McCormick and Deering agents literally racing each other down country roads to reach a farmer first. In 1902, a financier named J.P. Morgan brokered a deal. McCormick, Deering, and 3 smaller manufacturers, Milwaukee Harvester, Plano Manufacturing, and the Champion Line, merged to form the International Harvester Company. The new corporation, headquartered in Chicago, controlled about 85% of the American harvesting equipment market overnight. It was, by any measure, a monopoly, the federal government noticed. Antitrust suits followed almost immediately, and the company spent years fighting them. At one point between 1913 and 1918, they were even forced to rename themselves International Harvester Company of New Jersey as part of the legal fallout. But the company survived them all, and it kept growing. IH didn't just make harvesting equipment. Over the decades, they expanded into trucks, tractors, construction equipment, refrigerators, air conditioners, freezers, and lawn care. The Cub Cadet riding mower, the Scout utility vehicle. If it had an engine and went on a farm or a job site or a suburban driveway, there was a decent chance International Harvester made it. They even manufactured M1 Garand rifles for the Army during the Korean War, producing over 337,000 between 1951 and 1956. By the 1920s, International Harvester was already the largest farm equipment company in the world. But it had a problem. Henry Ford had entered the tractor market with his Fordson, and the Fordson was cheap, dangerously cheap. Ford was underselling everyone, and IH was losing market share fast. They needed a response, not just a cheaper tractor, a better idea. That idea came from a man named Bert Benjamin. Born in rural Iowa, educated at what's now Iowa State, Benjamin was IH's chief tractor engineer, and he had a vision that his bosses thought was crazy. He wanted to build a tractor that could do everything on a farm, not just plow, not just pull, but plant, cultivate, mow, harvest. One machine for all of it, an all-purpose row crop tractor. In 1921, IH General Manager Alexander Lega called a meeting to figure out how to counter Ford. Benjamin pitched his idea. Most of the executives thought it was too risky. The country was still recovering from the post-war recession. Pouring money into an unproven concept wasn't exactly popular. Benjamin pushed forward anyway. By 1923, they had prototypes ready. 200 units were built for field testing. Farmers thought the tricycle-style design with its narrow front wheels looked funny. Some of them laughed at it. Nobody laughed for long. In 1924, the McCormick Deering Farmall went into production. Priced at $825, about $8,500 in today's money. It weighed around 3,900 pounds and ran on a 4-cylinder engine that put out about 20 horsepower at the belt. Not much by modern standards. But here's what it could do. It could plow with a two-bottom trailing plow. It could cultivate between rows of corn or cotton without crushing the crops, thanks to its narrow front end and high rear axle that gave 30 inches of clearance. It had a power takeoff to drive binders, mowers, and harvesters directly from the tractor's engine. It could, as the name suggested, farm all. The tricycle design looked strange to farmers at first. Two small wheels up front, set close together. Two big lugged steel wheels in the back, set wide. People thought it looked funny, unstable, awkward. But once they saw what it could do in the field, the jokes stopped. By 1929, IH was producing over 15,000 Farmalls a year, and the tractor commanded 60% of the entire American tractor market. Every competitor scrambled to copy it. Deere tried a three-row design with their general-purpose model. Minneapolis Moline offered the combination tractor. Massey Harris went with four-wheel drive. Every one of them eventually abandoned their approach and adopted the Farmall's tricycle layout. By 1940, roughly 90% of all tractors sold in the United States were either Farmalls or designs that owed their basic concept to Bert Benjamin's original. The Farmall didn't just sell well, it replaced the horse, literally. Every tractor that took over from a team of horses freed up about 5 acres of land that had been used to grow feed for those animals. Multiply that across millions of farms, and the Farmall helped reshape the entire American landscape. For decades, International Harvester dominated. They kept innovating too. In 1977, IH introduced the axial flow rotary combine, a fundamentally different approach to grain harvesting that used a single rotor instead of the traditional cylinder and walker system. It was simpler, more efficient, and it's still the basis of Case IH combines today. In 1979, they launched the 2+2 four-wheel drive tractors, essentially two rear ends hooked together with a transfer case. Clever engineering, even if they never sold well. And in 1981, IH unveiled the 50 Series tractors, the last great lineup to carry the International Harvester badge. The 50 Series introduced the first computer monitoring system ever put on a farm tractor, called Sentry, along with an 18-speed synchronized transmission, a forward airflow cooling system, and color-coded hydraulic lines. IH spent over $29 million developing that series. The Farmall H, produced from 1939 to 1954, became the second best-selling tractor model in North American history, with over 420,000 units sold. IH made trucks, construction equipment, refrigerators, air conditioners, even the Scout utility vehicle. By the late 1970s, International Harvester was the fourth largest company in the United States, $8.4 billion in annual sales, record profits of $370 million in 1979, 35,000 unionized workers in 21 plants across 9 states, factories in Rock Island, Illinois, East Moline, Memphis, Louisville, Fort Wayne. And that is exactly when everything fell apart. The board of directors decided they needed a shakeup, so in 1977 they hired Archie McCardle away from Xerox. McCardle's salary was $460,000 a year, which made him one of the highest-paid CEOs in the country. He also got a $1.5 million signing bonus and a $1.8 million loan at 6% interest to buy company stock. The loan would be forgiven if McCardle outperformed IH's competitors. To his credit, McCardle moved fast. He cut spending by $640 million and launched an $879 million plant modernization program. The numbers looked good at first. 1979 brought record sales and record profits. But McCardle's profit margins were still only half of what Deere and Caterpillar were earning. The company looked healthy from the outside. Inside, the foundation was already cracking. McCardle decided the problem was the workers, specifically the work rules negotiated by the United Auto Workers. IH employees had no compulsory overtime, which McCardle said had cost the company $1.3 billion over 3 years. He wanted mandatory overtime, new scheduling rules, and a crackdown on wildcat strikes. Reasonable demands, maybe, but McCardle handled the negotiation the way you'd expect a guy from Xerox to handle a room full of factory workers. He went public with his bargaining demands before the union even had a chance to respond. He attacked seniority rules. He used inexperienced negotiators. He gave himself no room to compromise. On November 1, 1979, the same day IH announced that McCardle had received his $1.8 million bonus, 35,000 UAW members walked out of 21 plants across the country. McCardle wasn't worried. He figured the UAW was already financially stretched from strikes at Deere and Caterpillar. They'd come back to the table in a few weeks. He was wrong. The strike lasted 172 days. At the time, it was the longest strike in UAW history. IH lost nearly $600 million. Sales dropped 47%. Short-term debt exploded from $442 million to $1 billion. The company had to put the Scout division up for sale just to cover the bleeding. When the strike finally ended in April 1980, the union called it a victory. Wall Street analysts agreed. IH got almost nothing it had asked for. One analyst put it simply, the company was the big loser. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. Now, the strike alone might not have killed International Harvester. What killed it was timing. The strike ended right as the American farm economy began its worst collapse since the Great Depression. Here's what happened. Throughout the 1970s, the federal government had encouraged farmers to expand. Crop prices were high. Exports to the Soviet Union were booming. Interest rates were low. Farmers borrowed heavily to buy more land and equipment. Farm debt for land and equipment doubled between 1978 and 1984. Then everything reversed at once. The Federal Reserve, trying to control inflation, jacked interest rates to 21.5% in 1981. That's not a typo. 21.5% on borrowed money. At the same time, President Carter imposed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union after the Afghanistan invasion, cutting off one of America's biggest export markets. The double hit was devastating. Farmland in Iowa lost 60% of its value between 1981 and 1986. In some counties, the drop was closer to 54%. Farm debt, which had soared during the good years, was now backed by collateral that was worth a fraction of what it had been. Banks started calling in loans. Farmers who had been millionaires on paper in 1979 were bankrupt by 1983. 300,000 farmers defaulted on their loans by the end of the decade. For every 4 farms that closed, one rural business went with them. Grocery stores, restaurants, hardware shops, the main streets of small towns across the Midwest hollowed out. In 1985, Farm Aid concerts started, trying to raise money and awareness. Chapter 12. Bankruptcy was created in 1986 specifically for family farmers. Some farmers didn't make it that long. There are accounts from dealers and neighbors of men who walked into their barns or their parts departments after hours and didn't come out alive. The human cost of the farm crisis was not abstract. 11,500 farm equipment dealers existed in 1979. By 1985, only 5,800 remained. If you figure the average dealership employed about 18 people, that's roughly 100,000 jobs gone. Half the dealer network in America erased. The farm crisis didn't just hurt International Harvester, it devastated the entire industry. Massey Ferguson, Alice Chalmers, and IH all reported losses exceeding $200 million in 1982 alone. But IH was in the worst position because it was already hemorrhaging from the strike. The company's total debt hit $4.5 billion. In December 1981, IH had to negotiate with 200 lenders to restructure $4.15 billion in debt just to avoid bankruptcy. Then McCardle made his final mistake. In January 1982, while asking the UAW for $100 million in wage concessions, he approved $6 million in bonuses for salaried executives. The union walked away from the negotiating table. When they finally came back in March, it took until May to reach a deal that gave IH $200 million in savings over 3 years. On May 3, 1982, one day after the UAW ratified the concessions, the board of directors fired Archie McCardle. He later told reporters he rated himself superb. He also said he thought he was underpaid. The company had lost a combined $2.4 billion over fiscal years 1980, 81, and 82. At the time, it was the largest 3-year loss of any American company in history. The construction equipment division was sold to Dresser Industries in 1982. What was left was a bleeding farm equipment business and a truck division that was barely holding on. Louis Menck, a former president and CEO of the Burlington Northern Railroad, took over as chairman and brought in Donald Lennox as chief operating officer. They tried everything: workforce reductions of 25%, plant consolidations across the country. Salaried employees took 5% pay cuts. Officers took 29% cuts. But the farm economy kept getting worse, and IH kept losing money. By the fall of 1984, all options had run out. The banks throughout the world had had enough. Now, here's where we need to talk about the other side of this merger, because there were 2 companies involved, and the one doing the buying had its own history worth knowing. Jerome Increase Case. Yes, that was his real name. Born in 1842 in Racine, Wisconsin. The man was a threshing machine salesman who realized he could build better machines than the ones he was selling. He founded the Racine Threshing Machine Works, which eventually became the J.I. Case Company. By 1886, Case was the world's largest manufacturer of steam engines. The company was the first to build a diesel-powered tractor back in 1892. In 1911, Case had 3 cars in the first Indianapolis 500. Not a farm equipment company you'd expect at a car race, but there it was. By the 1980s, Case was owned by Tenico, a Houston-based conglomerate that had its fingers in oil, gas, shipbuilding, and farm equipment. Tenico had bought Case in the late 1960s, then purchased British tractor manufacturer David Brown in 1972. Case made good tractors but lacked a full line of implements. No combines, no cotton pickers, no complete tillage lineup. They were half a company looking for the other half. International Harvester was the other half. On November 26, 1984, IH Chairman Don Lennox made the announcement. Tenico would acquire IH's agricultural division for roughly $430 million in cash and stock. The base cash price was $246.7 million. One IH dealer heard it on the radio and told his son the sleeping giant is dead. The Justice Department reviewed the deal for antitrust concerns and approved it. By February 1985, the transaction was complete. The farm equipment brand that Cyrus McCormick started in 1831, the company that Bert Benjamin's Farmall had built into the dominant force in American agriculture, the name that had been painted on the side of red tractors for 82 years, now belonged to Tenico. Here's the part that stings. When IH sold the agricultural division, the International Harvester name and the IH logo went with it. The company that was left behind, the truck and engine divisions, had to rename itself. In 1986, International Harvester officially became Navistar International Corporation. They kept making trucks under the International brand, but the Harvester name was gone. The new entity was called Case International at first, then shortened to Case YH. Production at IH's legendary Farmall Works plant in Rock Island, where tractors had been built since 1926, ceased in May 1985. The last IH tractor, a Model 5488, rolled off that line on May 14, 1985. Machinery and tooling were moved to Case's factory in Racine. The Memphis Works plant closed entirely. IH's axial flow combined production continued at the East Moline factory, which was one of the few operations to survive relatively intact. For the dealers, the merger was chaos. Every IH dealer received a termination agreement from Case. They were offered $25,000 to cover things like signs, service manuals, and price lists if they signed on with the new company. An extra $10,000 if they signed within 14 days. Some dealers took the deal. Some walked away. The ones who stayed had to sell red tractors that now said Case on them instead of International. To a lot of those dealers and to their customers, that felt like a betrayal. But the thing is, the merger probably saved both companies. Case needed IH's product line. IH's agricultural division needed Case's financial backing through Tenico. And both of them needed the farm economy to recover, which eventually it did. The prime rate dropped to 11.5% by 1985. Farmers started buying equipment again, not fast, but enough. The first real product of the merger arrived in August 1987 when Case IH revealed the Magnum series at a dealer meeting in Denver. This was the tractor that would determine whether the merged company lived or died. If the Magnum failed, Case YH was finished. The engineering team had combined the best of both companies. The engine came from a joint venture between Case and Cummins, a 505 cubic inch, 8.3-liter turbocharged six-cylinder diesel. The transmission, cab, frame, front and rear axles, power takeoff, and hydraulic systems were based on IH designs that had been in development before the merger. 4 models launched: the 7110 at 130 horsepower, the 7120 at 150, the 7130 at 170, and the 7140 at 195. The engine had 25% fewer parts than previous designs, which meant less to go wrong and longer service intervals. The 18-speed full power-shift transmission was so reliable that most dealers never saw the inside of one unless they were training a new technician. The hydraulic system ran on Heatran fluid, a specialty oil developed for IH back in the 1960s by Viscosity Oil Company of Chicago, and it's still the recommended fluid for Case IH tractors today. The cab set new standards for operator comfort and visibility, an area where red tractors had frankly been behind green ones since the 1960s. Forward-tilting hood for easy engine access, mechanical front-wheel drive as an integrated option rather than a bolt-on afterthought. The Magnum introduced the red paint scheme that became the signature of Case 1H, replacing the older, darker IH red. It looked modern. It looked confident. It looked like it belonged in a new era, which was exactly the point. The Magnum was a hit. It brought customers back who had left when the merger was announced. John Deere was reportedly nervous enough that they acquired a couple of early Magnums through employees who farmed, evaluated them, then placed them with dealers advertising low hours, implying the previous owner had been unhappy and traded up to a green tractor. The scheme was quickly exposed. In 1986, Case 1H also purchased Steiger Tractor, the articulated four-wheel drive specialist from Fargo, North Dakota. That gave them the high horsepower end of the market. In 1989, the Maxim series filled the gap below the Magnum. By the early 1990s, Case YH had a full tractor lineup that could compete with Deere across every horsepower range. In 1995, Case YH became the first agricultural manufacturer to offer advanced farming systems with GPS technology. In 1999, Case Corporation merged with New Holland to form CNH Global, creating one of the largest agricultural and construction equipment companies in the world. And in 2004, Case YH brought back the Farmall name for a line of small utility tractors. Bert Benjamin's brand resurrected. Not as the industry-defining force it once was, but at least not forgotten. The former International Harvester, now Navistar, kept making trucks and engines. They struggled financially through the 2000s. In 2016, Traton, a subsidiary of Volkswagen, bought a 16.6% stake. In 2021, Volkswagen completed a full acquisition for $3.7 billion. The company that Cyrus McCormick founded in the 1840s, that became International Harvester in 1902, that built the Farmall and the Scout, and fed America for the better part of a century, is now owned by a German automaker. In 2023, Volkswagen even announced plans to revive the Scout name as an electric vehicle brand. So what actually killed International Harvester? It wasn't one thing. It was a sequence. Decades of profit margins that lagged behind competitors, going all the way back to the Great Depression. A boardroom that hired an outsider who didn't understand the culture he was walking into. A strike that bled the company dry at the worst possible moment. A farm crisis that crushed demand for years. And a set of decisions, from McCardle's bonus to the executive payouts during concession talks, that destroyed whatever trust remained between management and labor. The thing about IH is that even at its lowest point, the engineering was still good. The 50 series tractors were excellent machines. The axial flow combine was a genuine breakthrough. The problem was never the product, it was the business. IH had been running on thinner margins than its competitors for decades, and when the storm hit, there was no cushion. Deere survived the farm crisis. Caterpillar survived. They hurt badly, but they made it through. IH didn't, because it had been slowly weakening from the inside for 40 years before the strike, and the recession delivered the knockout punch. The IH name survives today only as 2 letters on the side of Case YH equipment. The Farmall Works factory in Rock Island is gone. The Memphis plant is gone. The European division was eventually sold off and exists today as McCormick Tractors, owned by an Italian company called Argo. The company that once employed over 100,000 people and operated manufacturing plants in Belgium, France, Germany, Australia, and a dozen other countries exists now as a brand within a brand within a multinational conglomerate, CNH Industrial, which is itself jointly listed in Amsterdam and New York. But drive through the Midwest on any harvest day, and you'll still see red tractors in the fields. Some of them are Magnums, some are Steigers, some are newer Farmalls, carrying a name that Bert Benjamin first coined in the early 1920s. And some, if the farmer is old enough and sentimental enough, are vintage letter series Farmalls from the 1940s and 50s, still running, still working, 70 or 80 years after they rolled off the line in Rock Island. The iron outlasted the company that made it. There's something in that worth remembering, and there you have it. The company that mechanized American farming, undone by a boardroom brawl and the worst farm economy in 50 years. If you grew up around these tractors, or your family did, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week.